Hello and welcome everyone to today's session. We so appreciate each and every one of you showing up for this session on intersectionality and racial equity for survivors in permanent supportive housing. So we have quite a full agenda, so we're going to just jump right in. So I will pass it over to Amy.
Thank you, Saba. I have the privilege of welcoming you all here today. I'm the CEO of Downtown Women's Center, located in Los Angeles. Among a full continuum of services, the Downtown Women's Center provides for women experiencing homelessness. For over 40 years, we've also been providing permanent supportive housing for survivors of trauma, namely domestic violence. In 2016, along with a renowned domestic violence service called Rainbow Services in Los Angeles, we created the Los Angeles Domestic Violence Homeless Services Coalition. In our coalition of survivors and homeless services organizations, domestic violence organizations, government employees, researchers, and philanthropic partners, we have been striving to build out a full continuum of housing resources for survivors at this intersection of domestic violence and housing instability. As a sector, we know a lot about how to provide emergency and transitional housing. And thankfully, our field has grown tremendously to provide rapid rehousing, namely through the now best practice of domestic violence housing first. But little is actually known about creating and utilizing permanent supportive housing as an intervention for individuals and families at this particular intersection. So we partnered with the National Alliance for Safe Housing and we wrote a toolkit. And for the first time ever, it incorporates unique perspectives from survivors as well as architects, service providers, housing developers, and property managers. And I'm pleased to share today that the Corporation for Supportive Housing is recognizing this toolkit on building supportive housing for survivors with an innovation award during their 30th anniversary symposium just later on today. We launched the toolkit earlier this year and we heard from our audience the topics that they wanted to dive deeper in, and that brings us here today. Today's conversation is a deeper dive into Chapter 4 related to intersectionality and racial equity of DV survivors in permanent supportive housing programs. In our time here today, we will draw heavily on the framework of intersectionality, anti-racism, and cultural humility, each of which are integral to the trauma-informed approaches to service provision. And we hope that you will gain insights from our amazing experts into research about systemic anti-Black inequalities, highlighting some work in Los Angeles, but relevant for our work nationwide. And it's my absolute pleasure to introduce you to Saba Mawini, a director of Homeless Policy Research Institute. Thank you, Saba.
Thank you, Amy, for that wonderful introduction to why we're all kind of here together and the wonderful work that DWC does. My name is Saba Mawini. My pronouns are she, hers. And yes, I'm the managing director of the Homelessness Policy Research Institute at USC. But I'm only brand new to that position. Actually, this month, I've been transitioning from CSH to this role. And so over the course of the last several years, I've had the pleasure of working with supportive housing providers, developers, and property managers, and got to collaborate with NASH and DWC by contributing the Supportive Housing Institute curriculum, which again was one of the many materials that sort of we came together to create the amazing toolkit that we have. And so I want us to take a moment today, because all of these webinars and and this work, we're always seeking to be trauma informed. So I wanted to give us a moment this morning to have a little bit of somatic practice together, and just get a chance to sort of form our virtual circle of light. So if you're able to, go ahead and close your eyes. If you're, if you can, go ahead and take a seat. And just to go ahead and do like a mental scan. And take a moment to place your hand on your heart. And just have a moment to feel on what things you have gratitude for this morning, what people, and breathe into that. And then we're going to take 3 breaths together. So let's gather ourselves. And so go ahead and take a deep inhale in. And exhale out. Another inhale in. And exhale out with sound. And one last inhale in. And exhale out with sound and movement. Shake it out. Okay. So I invite you to just do a quick check-in to how you're feeling now after having that little time to breathe, and to stay conscious about the messages from your body throughout this whole session together, because we're going to be talking about trauma, and we know that trauma lives in our bodies, so we want to stay present with ourselves. And so our aim together today is to be a community learning space. We want to share with you some information, some community experiences and wisdom, practitioners' work, as well as community-based research. And we really, with the aim that after this session, we're going to feel inspired to take some step in our journey on practicing anti-racism, some next step. And later on, we'll ask you guys to share with us in the chat what that might be. And then after we are through with our presentations, we'll have time for Q&A. So please do enter your questions into the chat. And so we want to get started with our introductions of our panel today. So thank you so much, panelists. I'm just going to ask you to share your name, your pronouns, and then 1 or 2 sentences about what brought you to this work. And we'll start with Shanti.
Thank you, Saba. My name is Shanti Kulkarni, and I go by she, hers. And I've been in this field a long time, over 20 years. And I think what keeps me in it is just the inspiration I find working with survivors.
Thank you so much, Shanti. Go ahead, Adaline.
Hi, good morning. So my name is Adaline. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I was afforded an opportunity as a peer support specialist at the Downtown Women's Center. What keeps me, or what pushed me into this work, is I was a homeless youth at the age of 16 in Skid Row. And I just like helping those that have been in, where I've been, homeless. I've dealt with a lot since I was 16 living in Skid Row. And I just like helping others reach their fullest potential like I've been helped.
Thank you so much, Adaline. And so rounding it off, Dean.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. It's great to be with you and to share this space with you, and I'm excited to learn from you. My name is Dean Obermark. I'm a researcher or data scientist at the California Policy Lab. My pronouns are he, him, his. Yeah, I think I've come to this work specifically on sort of policy issues in LA related to homelessness. After doing work on the criminal justice system for several years and really looking at racial inequities in the criminal justice system. So in some ways, there's sort of a lot of carryover there. And I think especially in sort of homelessness services, I appreciate working in this space because I think it's a system that's needed. It's a system that should exist, and it's a system worth improving. So that's been sort of a joyful transition from working on criminal justice to working on homelessness services. So yeah, I think I'm motivated by sort of imagining sort of alongside the people who run programs and the people who use programs, how they could be better, how they could better serve them and sort of lead to stable housing for everyone.
All right, so grateful to get to know your particular paths to this work. And so thank you, panelists, for sharing that. The learning has already begun. I've already learned from your introduction, so appreciate you. And so actually, we're going to kick off this next section with a video called The Intersections Between Domestic and Sexual Violence, Racism, and Homelessness. This is provided to us by Safe Housing Partnership. And it's really going to ground us in some shared language. And so I really recommend that those of us that are taking anti-racist organizational practices, that we really do make sure we have shared language for these concepts. And certainly the toolkit is a resource for that. So we can go ahead and queue up the video. And for those of you who will want a link to this video, we'll make sure to send it to you in an email.
Homelessness is an issue that far too many people face. Homelessness is an issue that far too many people face. People of color, specifically Black people, other persons of color, and Indigenous people, experience homelessness in a dramatically different way than their white counterparts. People who hold multiple identities, such as those who live at the intersections of disability, immigration status, sexual orientation, gender identity, and more, experience compounded barriers that further homelessness and housing instability. A recent study found that 66% of people experiencing homelessness were Black, while 28% were white. Black individuals are only 13% of the US general population, compared to 74% of those who are white. Rates of homelessness within Native communities are 3 to 8 times higher than that of the general population. In total, 78% of people experiencing homelessness identified as people of color. This overrepresentation of Indigenous, Black, and other people of color experiencing homelessness cannot be explained by poverty or identity alone. Structural racism, historical policies, institutional practices, and cultural narratives that perpetuate racial inequity put people of color at a disadvantage in obtaining safe and affordable housing. Statistically, women of color are much more likely to experience domestic and sexual violence, and survivors often face network impoverishment. Network impoverishment occurs when the addition of a financially distressed household member
As
places
good
an
as the
extra
video
strain on
is and
family
this
resources.
concept, I mean, we really could go for watching more of it, but it was too many good things for that we would miss if we watched the whole thing. So thank you so much for that screening of that clip of that video, to Jenny, who was able to do that for us. And so the intersectionality term, I love how it's defined in there, the compounded impact really of multiple marginalized identities. So women of color, people of color who also identify as LGBTQ. Those who hold those identities are really at the real margin, that we talk about when we speak about how communities are marginalized. And then that disproportionate rate of BIPOC experiencing homelessness is really consistent throughout the country. So there's a very strong pattern for that disproportionality. And because of that, a lot of several communities have been working with their COCs, their continuums of care, and advocates that are seeking to end homelessness in their communities to sort of really address this issue, because just to understand the issue of homelessness as a product of racism. And in fact, in Los Angeles, we've had quite an effort where our COC, LASA, really got behind a community engaged research process that we have been kind of realizing for the last several years, since 2017, when the report was issued. So there's an ad hoc report on Black people experiencing homelessness, which was produced by the Ad Hoc Committee on Black people experiencing homelessness. So that's a group of people with lived experience, homeless service providers, housing rights advocates, mental health providers, faith leaders. And they really did active engagement with Black people who are housing unstable, who have experiences of homelessness, and were able to produce 67 recommendations for Los Angeles County to really end or address meaningfully the Black disproportionality rate in the population of people experiencing homelessness. And today, actually, we have an opportunity to hear findings from recent research that stemmed from that report. And the aim was to help us understand why Black residents of permanent supportive housing are returning to homelessness at twice the rate of white residents. And so this is where we're going to pull up the slides here. And I'd like Dean to share with us your team's findings and what implications they have for moving forward anti-racist ways of being in our community.
Thanks, Saba. Great, I can see the slides. So yeah, just to start off and give sort of maybe a bit of additional context about this project. As Saba said, there really is a through line to the work of the ad hoc committee, which I'm really grateful for. And we're able to continue to engage some ad hoc committee members in the work itself, which was immensely helpful. They just provide us with so many insights sort of throughout the research process, from like data collection to even interpreting what we were seeing in the data. And then two of my my collaborators or co-authors on this work are Norwida Milburn, who also provided and helped support the ad hoc committee, and Earl Edwards, who was I think a research liaison, or really directed a lot of the ad hoc committee's work. So Norwida provided sort of supervision and oversight and a ton of guidance for this work. And Earl and I were more in the weeds, collecting data and analyzing the data, and sort of doing this quantitative and qualitative mixed methods approach, as Saba said, try to understand what's happening in permanent supportive housing in LA. And I'd also just take a moment to acknowledge sort of other colleagues and team members, sort of past and present, who've contributed to this work. Sometimes research is weirdly portrayed as being sort of a solo thing, and that's completely false. It's usually collaborative. These are like 8 people that did a lot of work on the project, but the slide could be even larger because we've been really supported by everyone at CPL, as well as other colleagues at UCLA. Can go to the next slide, please. So really the core sort of issues that animate this work stem from things pointed out in the ad hoc committee report. So we know that that across the United States, as the video pointed out, and in LA County in particular, Black people are about 4 times overrepresented in experiencing homelessness compared to their proportion in the general population. So this varies a little bit depending on the PIC count and estimates of population. We consistently, historically, unfortunately, have really always seen this very severe overrepresentation for Black people in the US as well as LA County. And that's also true for folks with Indigenous identities and other minoritized groups like our Latinx community in LA. So in the PSH system in particular, we're looking at sort of a different inequity. So not so much people's initial experience of homelessness, but we're really delving into once people get into PSH and are served by PSH programs, what happens to them afterwards. And when we sort of keep on peeling back the onion here, we see that in LA County, about a quarter of all Black residents who get PSH eventually return to homelessness, which we measure through the HMIS, which I think that the toolkit also covers, but it's just the administrative system for homelessness. So this sort of overrepresentation returns, right? And compared to white residents, Black residents, I guess in our best estimate, we think are around 39 or 40% more likely to return to homelessness. So it's a very severe inequity. Our work first proceeded quantitatively. So we just worked on trying to estimate that inequality, the inequity, and then we really used qualitative methods to sort of better understand the underlying factors that are driving that, to really dig into the reasons behind the inequity. Can go to the next slide. So this is just a table kind of summarizing what I was talking through. So again, we see that Black residents, although they do account for around 50% of all PSH enrollments, which is a good thing because we see Black people are hugely overrepresented in homelessness, and it's good that they're getting connected to housing programs. We see that a quarter of them return to homelessness eventually. Our work is focused on Black people's experiences, but that's not to diminish the importance of experiences of other groups. So we also see elevated rates of return for folks in the Latinx community, folks in the American Indian or Alaska Native community as well. And though we're not able to break them out separately here because of a relatively small sample, we see high rates of return for Native Hawaiians and other Pacific Islanders. These are the main identity groups that are covered in the HMIS data. I want to say that I know they're not applicable to everyone. I know we wish they were more fine-grained and better reflected people's own self-identification, but unfortunately, this is the sort of the limit of the data that we have to work with. But I guess the point is we see across the board in the LA permanent supportive housing system that Black, Indigenous, and other people of color are returning to homelessness at really high rates after getting services. They're not being retained in housing. And when they leave housing, they're returning to homelessness. So I'll talk through sort of a few of the major qualitative findings on the next slide. Again, this only pertains to Black people because that's how we constructed our qualitative sample. We want to talk to case managers and service providers, as well as Black residents themselves and former residents about their experiences. You can go to the next one. So again, the core question kind of becomes like, what's happening to Black residents that's pushing them out of PSH and towards re-experiencing homelessness? And through our data collection and sort of learning throughout the process, I think we very much started to view this in terms of a pipeline of experiences of how people experience and navigate the system and come into PSH. So really there are factors, I think, at 3 main stages. And I also want to point out that that these are sort of potential reasons, and they're not just one thing. So I think we know that these things apply to certain folks, but not to others. I think what's really nice about qualitative research is that it enables us to have this nuanced perspective and to point to multiple sort of deeply embedded systemic factors that drive this issue in LA. we see in the sort of enrollment in PSH and the initial search for housing. So this is stuff that's happening even before people are placed in a PSH program. In LA, there's strong bureaucratic processes that sort of respond to and reinforce residential segregation. So because of LA's geographic size and population size, we're organized into service planning areas, which are sort of, I think there are 6 or 7 or 8 across LA. Someone who actually works at Provider, I'm sure, will let me know how right or wrong I am in the chat. But these service planning areas, although they may make the delivery of services sort of more manageable, they also have the potential to sort of reinforce the existing patterns of segregation, right? So the service planning areas, I think, were created in the 90s and overlaid over a highly segregated LA County. And just from our interviews with providers, it became pretty clear that there's this sort of bureaucratic momentum of inertia that once you're serving a resident or program participant in a certain area, you're likely to keep them in that area. And oftentimes that was, regardless of their preferences for where they'd like to be housed. Another thing sort of that happens in the pre-housing process that I want to point to is especially relevant and connecting sort of to the toolkit as well. And the toolkits, I think, comment on Section 8 and as a institutional racism and historical racism, is that we see, because of the system's dependency on tenant-based resources, which on one hand have the promise to really give people more flexibility in where they want to live, but on the other hand are really subject to landlord housing discrimination. We see in our interviews with case managers that case managers are often steering Black residents towards particular units where they know they'll be accepted or more likely to be accepted. So although these tenant-based vouchers sort of have the promise of more choice, for Black residents, that's a very much more constrained choice. And the residents that we interviewed in particular often felt that they were being placed in areas where they wouldn't choose to live. They were sort of forced to live there because of lack of opportunities. And then finally, I just want to comment that PSH programs throughout LA County, many of you already know this, but they're just very different things. They vary in terms of funding, in terms of what the unit's like, in terms of location, the community. And it's not clear to us that variation is being taken into account when matching clients to resources. Within PSH, we also saw sort of a litany of factors. I'll point to 2 of them in particular here. Since we were talking about intersectional identities and homelessness among folks who have survived intimate partner or domestic violence, I think the lack of safety and security, which is something almost everyone we interviewed discussed, is a really particularly relevant factor. So folks describe this in different ways, from just not feeling secure in their unit itself, to not feeling secure or safe in their building, and oftentimes to not feeling secure in the community in which they were located. So I think this is obviously a problem that could be compounded for folks who have survived domestic or intimate partner violence. Unfortunately, I don't have time to share the qualitative data with you today, but we just have some vivid quotes from our interviews about sort of continual harassment that happened, even when folks are placed in PSH and should be hopefully protected from these things. The other thing I wanted to point to is just really frank discussion of pathologizing and racist treatment of Black residents once they're in PSH. So I think this was coming from multiple directions. It was often coming from case managers. It was sometimes coming from property managers. And then it was coming from the system itself. So some of the case managers we interviewed discussed how their residents had prior diagnoses of mental health issues that they speculated were misdiagnoses, that they were in fact sort of overdiagnosed, and that those diagnoses would lead to their behaviors being interpreted differently, right? So someone having a bad day and expressing frustration, who's been misdiagnosed with something like bipolar disorder, might be subject to sort of to different interventions, and potentially more harsh interventions than someone without that diagnosis. Almost everyone we talked to sort of felt as if the system had infantilized them, treated them like children, and generally wanted to have more authority and autonomy over their own lives, which I think is something that everyone can relate to. It's sort of a basic requirement. And I think sort of using the framework of cultural humility is really helpful here too. What they were asking for is to be seen and to be understood, and for the system to respond to them as such. And it seems clear that the current system isn't doing this. And then one thing or two things I'll point about sort of the challenging transitions out of this desire for growth and desire for more autonomy. A lot of the residents we interviewed wanted to move on to other forms of housing, sometimes more traditional forms of subsidized housing, like a Section 8 voucher. One problem they pointed to is that their PSH services largely didn't focus on preparing them to live more independently, to navigate a very complex Section 8 voucher process, and then to sort of equip them to navigate the structurally racist housing market and society into which they were trying to re-enter. So one of our residents did succeed in getting a Section 8 voucher, only to end up living 3 or 4 minutes from where she'd lived previously in a community that she found to be undesirable. And she was attributing this to her experiences of discrimination in the housing market. We know that Section 8 vouchers in general are subject to landlord discrimination. For Black residents and for Black people who have experienced homelessness, I think we can think of it in terms of interacting and layered discrimination as well. So even though folks have sort of achieved this milestone of more autonomy, they're still re-entering a society with the same structurally racist characteristics that led them to experience homelessness in the first place. So unfortunately, it's really a vicious cycle and a re-experience of the same factors that I think lead people to experience homelessness in the first place. So I think that's all I have today. I'm happy to talk about any of these things more in particular. I'm happy to say we finally will have a written report, I think next Wednesday. So if folks want to read more and actually see some of the really rich qualitative data themselves, the report should be available soon. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Dean. And thank you too for answering the question I had in my mind, which was about the report. Really appreciate those findings. And I think that piece at the very end, the navigating a structurally racist system, is really, that's sort of like the bottom line, where, to the extent that we can create racially affirming spaces in supportive housing is ideal. And knowing that outside of, with even if we do our best to do that, we're still in practice. It's still something that we have to really lean in on every day, and to be conscious of the outside structures and systems that are pulling us in that direction. So, and yeah, I especially grateful for, just the people that came through for that study. Black community members who have experienced homelessness, and Black frontline workers who contribute daily to creating safe spaces for people, especially Black people who have had experiences of homelessness. And we are actually very fortunate today to be joined by someone, a community member who holds such experience and expertise. So thank you so much, Adaline, for joining us. And I would love it if you could share with us some examples or stories of how we can think to practice anti-racism in PSH.
Well, thank you, Siba, so much. And thank you, Dean. Everything you said resonated with me. I could not stop shaking my head up and down. I'm like, I'm going to get a cramp in my neck. I was like, yes, that's all true. That's all true. I experienced every last thing that was on that list. And it gives me chills because, yeah. So yes, I stayed in a transitional shelter with many women, including domestic violence survivors, where I encountered a lack of confidentiality with the property manager. This experience like, it stands out to me to this day. Anytime anyone, inquires about an experience that just I wish I never went through, this is that experience. The manager did not know how to connect with addressing homelessness or with keeping the confidentiality of those that were in the transitional shelter. There was an instance where she decided to host a group so that we all may express our experience. And, you know, I was thinking, she's going to give some type of feedback that's constructive and healing. But after everyone shared their experience, her answer to all that was shared was no real feedback. She was like, I have no experience with any of this. She really, I just sat there like, why did we all just share our personal stories to this woman who honestly really just told us that she has nothing to say because she hasn't experienced homelessness. She hasn't experienced domestic violence. And to me, it not only showed the lack of safety that was highlighted today, but also the lack of training. In addition to, it showed her privilege. Um, I it I didn't understand. Like, to me, every time I hear privilege, I'm like, what is that? um, I'm like, I wish I can experience a little bit of that. But it was shocking to me because I'm like, and then we all just got up and just like, she's like, okay, you guys have a good day. And I'm like, you just had the privilege of hearing our story and then telling us that you had no experience with what we're experiencing, and that that you felt bad. And to me, it was like, did you just want to hear each one of our stories? And like, are you writing a book? Like, I was like, what is going on right now? Because I hate to be the next chapter of someone's book, just getting my information and then just writing it down and then just hoping that this story could be something that she could tell her friends or tell the next person. I was able to finally see the types of anti-racist policies that should be incorporated in any housing structure, particularly permanent supportive housing, through the housing justice program that I work for with Downtown Women's Center. I was showed the opposite of everything that I experienced. One of the things that I feel like, and I like to highlight, as a peer support specialist, is that they had different systems to help with the healing. They have the case manager, they have the therapist, they have the peer support specialist that understand the personal experience with inequalities, especially through domestic violence and housing access. I do think that training is super important for public supportive housing staff on the topics of anti-racism and trauma-informed care. I cannot express how much I just like everything that Dean said right now. I was like, we need trainings on all of that, please. And thank you. Because you never know what you might say to someone and you think you might be helping them, but you're just hurting them. You're just hurting them. And that's the worst thing that you can do to someone, is listen to them and then just hurt them again. Because to me, that's just another thing that I really didn't want to experience. I shared my soul and my experience from when I was 16 years of age, all the way up until I was in transitional housing at the age of 20. And I finally got my permanent supportive housing at 22, and I'm 25. So it hasn't even been 10, well, it marks my 10 years of, addressing homelessness in December 25th on my birthday. And it still feels very raw to me. And the privilege that she had to say that to us as a group of women, I was very upset. And there was nothing I can say because, like Dean said, there's repercussions. I don't know how many times I walked into a housing meeting to move into a place, and I was told, you know, that I didn't sound like the way I looked, that my last name as Bertha didn't sound, you know, who as the person I am when they see my face. And it's very shocking. And to this day, it's really hard for me to just be able to express this without feeling the pain behind sometimes I be like, I sound like I'm gonna cry because the pain is still there. It's always gonna be there. And I'm still healing myself while, working with others, because I feel like that's my goal. I should be giving back. I should be giving them what I wished I received.
That is such a strong testimony. And I just want to say it's just an honor for us to bear witness to your story. And it's sacred. And I'm sorry that happened, because like you said, I know it still comes up as a point of pain. And at the same time, I see you as just this, beacon of light doing the work that you're doing. And I wondered if you could, a couple things, like share with us, like some of the practices that you find to be healing. And also maybe describe a little bit more about your role in your work and how you work with community.
So one of the things, one practice that I am very passionate about when it comes to just working with those that are in recovery from anything is, listening without having, what should I be replying back? Should I, how should I say this? Just listen to what they have to say and then go from there. Don't always expect to have an answer right away, because you might say something. And I always say, your words are the most powerful thing that you have. I know in the past they said you can, a pen is more powerful than a sword. It very much is. And for me, I, as a peer support specialist, not only do I connect with the women by, I like to connect them to community as well, because a lot of women who wind up in Skid Row, what is Skid Row? A lot of people don't see Skid Row as a community. And I'm like, it very much is. And you have a support system and you have people in the community that are there for you. I like to build peer-to-peer relationships. So I like to be open and honest about my experience with everyone that I work with, so that they can feel like, okay, because I don't know how many times, and I love hearing this, is when they say, that happened to me too. Or I'll hear, girl, you just said exactly what I wanted to hear. And I'm like, what did I say? Because, sometimes I'm talking and I'm just sharing, and I don't expect everything I say to resonate with who I'm talking to. But I want to share as much as I can, because something that I may have done could have been the answer to their problem, to what they're going on in life. And that's another thing. If you can share your story, because there's people probably that you've sat to in very high positions that have probably went through exactly what I went through, homelessness. They've been through a lot, and you don't even know. They could have been like, oh, I was homeless for 15 years. And you're looking like, whoa, you've been homeless? And they're like, yeah. And I always say, like, I don't judge. I try to tell every last one of my friends, don't judge the next person you talk to, because the next person you talk to can open so many doors. I'm like, you're putting up this wall. And I tell them, don't put up this wall, because they've been through so much. The first thing that we do, and I say this for myself, is I put up a wall. I always say thankful to my case manager that I had back in the day. I gave her a hard time at 16, 17, because I was frustrated with my situation. And I hated when people would come to me and say, why did you put yourself in this position? how did I put myself, I'm 16, I didn't put myself in this position. You think I would not be with my mother if I could, not be with my family if I could? And it just like, it really, I don't know, it really hurts when people judge you before they get to know you. And I always say, just come in with the ability to listen. That's my biggest, if I would say that's the number one practice, because too many people, you know, they have this list of things they're looking for. Stop looking for that list. Listen to what the person has to say, because it might not be on that list. It really won't. Half of the time, it's something that you wouldn't even expect.
Oh, that's powerful. So again, we're learning so much from everything that you're saying. So just to reflect back, listen first, connect to community, no matter how that community is defined, you know, go ahead and find it. And then the transparency and kind of just being open and honest about who you are and the experiences that you've had. And, you know, because I agree, I think people will feel it when they know that you're kind of holding something back, you're trying to look at the form, you're trying to, you know, all the things that you said was about putting them and their experiences first. And that's super powerful. And I think that that's healing personally, you know, to be heard, you know, to be honestly, like, to have a relationship where someone's telling you about who they are just as much as you're telling them about who you are. And then that non-judgment piece is so vital. And thank you too for sharing about some of those what I'll call microaggressions, which really are kind of macro aggressions in my view, around, oh, you know, you talk to them on the phone. I know this happened to me. You talk to them on the phone and then you show up and there's like a little bit of surprise when they see who walked in the door. And that, you know, we laugh because of the recognition of having had that experience. And I think too, because humor is a way for us to kind of alleviate the trauma as well. So like, that's an important thing to note. But over time, those types of incidents are so cumulative and have a huge impact on our mental health. And so to the extent that we can kind of be very serious about our anti-racist practice in really unearthing what our biases are, because we all have biases. And so we just need to be really honest with ourselves about what they are and begin that exploration. So that was great, Adaline. Thank you so much. Was there anything else that we left out? I feel like we got even more once we started going.
Yeah, I think I was like, I don't want to go over the time, and I
No,
just
we're good.
You know, I didn't even look at my notes. I was like, I just talked from the heart, because at this point I was like, you know, I want to be as transparent as possible. And I always tell everyone, all the peer support relationships that I build with the participants, I always tell them, you know, be your authentic self. If you don't know what to say, just, you know, say it from your heart, exactly what you went through, what you feel. And I always tell them that. And sometimes I forget that for myself, because, you know, you wear so many hats. And sometimes I tell them, advocate for yourself, do this for yourself. And then I forget to do it for me. So I was like, you know what, let me go on and just practice that.
Self-care.
Yeah.
That's terrific. Thank you for that reminder. I think we all could use that reminder personally. So this is, you just really named so much about what I want to talk to now with some slides, and I'll just very briefly kind of cover some concepts that you really highlighted beautifully for us, but I want us to kind of get in our bones. So if we could have the slide deck up. Oh, that was so on point. Thank you. So I already kind of started to reference the term racial trauma. And so I just wanted to offer us a definition. So when we talk about racial trauma, I know people on this call are very familiar with trauma and trauma-informed care. So this is my happy place to be able to say, all right, now let's think about racial and racially trauma-informed care. And so it's complex trauma. That means it's ongoing. We don't know when it's going to happen. And that's part of the stress, is you don't know when it's going to happen. And so it's always there. And so you're kind of at a heightened level slightly all the time. And of course, we know that has bad implications for our health. And so, yeah, the types of racial trauma, I mean, it can be media images of people that look like you that are getting harmed. You know, it can be some of the microaggressions that we talked about. It can be internalized superiority and inferiority. I really want to recommend Resmaa Menakem's book, My Grandmother's Hands, because he really is speaking to us specifically about racial trauma and offering us some practices. Next slide, please. And what he lays out for us as a premise is that white body supremacy also exists in white bodies, right? So it's a community healing, it's a national healing project to heal our racial trauma. And it's geared specifically toward Black, white, and police bodies, this particular book. And he really is like giving us actual tangible ways to first recognize the racial trauma in our bodies, heal it, and then create more room in our nervous systems to basically be available to each other. And some of the examples of the practices that he provides in his tech and in this book are listed here. So I want us to definitely, all of us that are in this field should really read this book. In fact, we're in a book club right now with some other community members in the sector and alongside folks who have experienced racial trauma in the context of homelessness. Next slide, please. So I want to offer this look at sort of our, and this is not an exhaustive list of marginalized and mainstream identities, but I want to offer this as a tool for us to reflect on our own, how we're coming into this space. Like Adaline was talking about privilege, that the provider wasn't aware of their privilege, right? And so this is a great exercise for reflection and journaling. And so what it's asking is that if we were to imagine that in the center of this circle is where mostly all of the power is held, the most amount of power is assigned to those mainstream identities. And then to ask yourself, well, what is my social location to that power? And really unpack it and think about it on a daily basis, because you don't know what you don't know. And it can change based on where you are. So say like right now, I'm here before you, I'm facilitating, I'm, doing slidey things and such. So that's, I might be closer to the middle. But when I go and I'm in my car and, it's a 2010 Camry, kind of neutral. I don't know if the style of car makes a difference though. And I get pulled over by the cops, then maybe my marginalized identities are more up on the fore. So I really offer you guys to take a photo of this and do some journaling later and really reflect and start to bring that into your practice when you're working with clients. So next slide, please. And this we will also offer you in the email after the session. So we were able to partner with Dr. Wendy Ashley here in Los Angeles, who is a professor at CSUN and a therapist and specialist around racially conscious trauma-informed care. And she drew up this great chart that provides examples alongside every one of the pillars of trauma-informed care. We also did a webinar with her, myself, and two other colleagues with lived experience of being people of color and of experiencing homelessness. And so we'll share that with you as well. But she really went into some detail for us about how we can practice racially conscious trauma-informed care in the context of housing and supportive housing. Next slide, please. And lastly, I wanted to offer you this culturally specific model for services, which is a really great growth strategy if you're not there yet with your organization. If you are recognizing, like all of us are, that, oh, they're disproportionately people of color experiencing homelessness, how can we grow as an organization with consciousness, with anti-racist consciousness? And that would be to grow toward having Black, Indigenous people of color with lived experiences of homelessness being on your staff, on your board, and especially in leadership. And really being dedicated to the culture of those people that are in your housing. Whereas if we don't, then the dominant culture will be dominant white supremacy culture. And so that's sort of our default. So that's the consciousness of then what can it look like then if you have people like Black, Indigenous, or Indigenous population? How can you weave in their culture, that shared culture, into the way that you are as a community? And then the benefits of the model are just terrific. I mean, this is a really great paper that everyone should read because that affirmation of racial identity, less reliance on medical models of intervention, and improve client retention and longer periods of service engagement. So I really wanted to highlight that. And okay, so now that we kind of laid some groundwork, with some more concepts, we're going to delve even deeper. And so Shanti, I want to turn to you and just ask you, based on your research and your experiences in your work, how can providers disrupt the status quo of white supremacy for residents under their care? And we can advance to the next slide.
Great. And I just want to start by just thanking the presenters that have gone before me. I think Saba shared some really exciting ideas, and Adaline, I think you give us a glimpse into what a survivor-led movement could really look like with your wisdom. And Dean, it's amazing that you're able to use data to really shine a light on what's going on in your community. So what I'll try to offer is, I think, just echoing a lot of themes that you've heard people touch on today, that I've encountered through my research, or developed out of my research, which is primarily community-based participatory research, which means I work with service providers, I work with people with lived experience very closely to kind of develop the research and the findings. So I want to start with, this is a quote, and I don't normally read things, but I'm going to read the slide just so that because I think it's so powerful. And this is from a participant and one of the studies that I'll talk about a little bit. But she went by the name of Sasha. And so she tells, and she's a Black, formerly incarcerated woman. And she says, I can go to a property manager or a realtor with the background I have, the money in hand, and I have to have a white lady to say, oh, she's okay. I don't like that. I don't agree with it. Because if I'd have went with my Black self, I'd still be homeless. Still wouldn't have been given a chance. And I think that's the ugliest thing in the world. It's very dependent feeling. And I don't like that feeling. I don't like it, but I have to subject myself to that. Yes, I have. And so then I ask her, if you think about that well-meaning white person who's vouching for you, does it make a difference if they're not also acknowledging the racism in the situation? And she says, sometimes I think they do know, but they never say anything. Nope. Would it make a difference if they acknowledged it? And Sasha says, I think I would respect them a little bit more, that they're aware of what I go through totally, and not hide the fact or pretend the fact that it's not there altogether. I think I would respect that person a little bit more. Not that I don't respect them, because they are trying to help me. They just don't know how. So I just want to take a minute and let that land, the weight of that land. Because I think what she's telling us is here is this primary injury of seeking housing and encountering racism, but there's also a secondary injury that's happening, right? And that's because her experience is not being acknowledged by the service provider, right? And by this person who she knows wants to help her. But in some ways, the silence on this issue of race she's speaking to that, right? And she's speaking to the fact is that this person doesn't have the tools to provide what she really needs in that moment. So if we can just advance. Okay, so anyway, I've been thinking about this a lot. Like recently, I think as we're all being challenged to really understand how do these like invisible forces sometimes of racism like impact like the services that we're providing, and when we're trying to help, but we're really not being helpful and sometimes harming, like how do we do it differently? And this is from a recent study that I did with a victim services organization who actually had done a lot of work within their organization around dismantling racism, structural racism in the agency. And these are some of their experiences about, they're very much on a journey, right? They are still learning and they're not perfect and they're not there yet, but what have they learned in this journey that they can share with others? And so kind of the two primary areas that I want to highlight are that, first of all, to identify the racism is not that easy, right? So kind of like, because people don't give you a flashing sign like this is about race, right? It's very encoded. It could be very subtle. It could more like those microaggressions that Adaline described. And so often it's very difficult to put your finger on it, and it makes it hard for people to talk about it. And so that often there's this silence about race that we have in our everyday life, that we have in the culture, right? That when it comes to talking about it with clients, talking about it with colleagues, it's difficult, right? So that people need permission to have those conversations. People need to have skills to have those conversations because they're scary, but that is something that really has to be overcome. And the second thing really is that, which I think we've already talked about, our programs really aren't neutral, right? Like programs themselves have been designed to meet the needs of what the assumed needs of privileged people. And so often these programs aren't designed to really address the needs of those who are most marginalized. And so what happens often is, first of all, that you can encounter barriers, right? But also what it might mean is that in order to get what I need, I might really have to know how to game the system, right? And so it might mean that I'm not always truthful, or I present things in a certain way, and it can create sort of an adversarial relationship between people who are trying to gatekeep in some ways services that can be really scarce, and people who really desperately need those services. So these are sort of the problems, and the first step is kind of just being able to see it happening, right? And then they talked about the things they were engaging in, and I think that's where a lot of what Saba really shared are great resources to advance some of this. And so one thing is that and I say this as an organization because this is really a community doing it together. Like we can't change it on our own. Like we need to be in community with others with the same goal of undoing racism. And so that there's a need for ongoing reflection. So the kind of reflection that Saba challenged us and us all, right, to notice like what are our assumptions, what are our defaults, like how are we perpetuating racism, like not because we're bad people, but because we socialized in a racist society. So supporting that reflection, creating accountable communities. So that means that we all have blind spots, and how do we help each other see through those blind spots, right? And work through like the uncomfortableness of doing things that maybe we don't intend to do that perpetuate racist behavior. Another thing might be more at an organizational level, looking at like, often in agencies, direct line staff are the staff of color, and then the leadership tends to be more white. And so, and then if you look at who has power within the agency, it tends to fall on those lines. People on the front lines don't often have that empowerment or that agency to make decisions that they're best equipped to make because they're closest to the client, right? And so one of the things this agency was able to do was to empower those frontline staff to enact, very responsive, flexible kinds of decision-making that would advance those anti-oppressive practices. And then the final theme that came out was the need to, and I think especially around domestic violence, is that we are really having a reckoning in terms of our relationship to criminal justice. And so what does that mean if we're saying that we're becoming anti-racist, that we have to look at those relationships as well. And sometimes it might mean making choices about who we're going to stand with on certain issues, if we're going to stand with oppressed communities or with oppressors. So next slide. Okay, and this is something, just a model that that is, and I think we can provide this this article. Actually, it's on open access now, but this is something I wrote a couple years ago that looked at, so there really has been a movement within our domestic violence field to become more survivor-centered, to become more trauma-informed, to become more holistic, and it's coming from a lot of different directions. And so this is kind of an attempt to integrate some of those things. And so we really have a movement around survivor advocacy. We have culturally specific programs that have always been doing this work in ways that are very survivor-led and response, and we need to like uplift those practices and integrate them. That we have a lot more discussion about holistic needs that are beyond just violence, and how we address like a whole person's need rather than just kind of sending them here for this and here for that. And then the trauma-informed care movement that has been so significant in terms of just paying attention to how trauma is metabolized in the body, how it affects relationships, and how it informs how people are going to experience and seek care. And so one of the things I talk about in the article is that I think there are 4 things that come out to me that I think are helpful to think about across these service deliveries. And one, that there's an emphasis on power sharing. There's an emphasis on authenticity, and I think Adaline, you brought that up as well, just bringing your true self and really being transparent, and so that people can develop a trust in what you're saying and what you're doing. That we have to change our systems, and that also that there's no one size fits all services, and that we have to be able to adjust services to what people need. So I would say like that as we're navigating all these different service delivery models, just keep in mind that these are the qualities that they tend to share. And so we really want to be thinking, how are we enacting, reflecting, embodying some of these qualities? So next slide. Okay, and so this is just from the first study I talked to, and that was talked about, and this was working with marginal survivors from marginalized communities about their housing strategies. And I won't go, it will take we've had a whole webinar on this thing, so I can't possibly cover it. But I think what just what this graphic kind of illustrates is that, just everything that's going on as far as survivors, like when we think about services, they're not really addressing much of this, right? Like that we tend to focus on just to make assumptions about that there's enough affordable housing, right? And that we make assumptions about that people can earn enough to like be able to live in these places, right? We make assumptions about what the communities are like in terms of safety, right? We make assumptions about how those communities are changing, right? And so I think like what we're kind of called on is as a movement maybe is to do something bolder and to take a step back and look at how we can really disrupt this cycle, because I think as Dean's research pointed out, it's not enough just to get people into housing, because unless we do some pretty fundamentally radical things, like it's very likely that people will just kind of be stuck in this constant cycle. And I would point out, like, not only are they stuck in this cycle, but often the people, their families, the people they care about, their networks are also stuck in this very same cycle, right? So it's really a crisis in that way. So next slide. So I did want to share sort of from this study, and again, this is available too. We can provide a link. It's easy to find. About what were the recommendations that folks came up with around how to begin to disrupt. And so one was around providing comprehensive intersectional trauma-informed services. That's something we've talked about a lot today. And that comprehensive means that, whatever my needs are, that there's a place for them. I think one thing that's not up there, but kind of implied, is like the time limits that we have for services really don't always reflect the time that's actually needed for people to have access to support. Another recommendation is around advancing these cross-sector collaborations. And I think it's really exciting what's happening in LA, I think, particularly around trying to break down the silos between homelessness and DV. But, there's mental health, there are many other systems, and these systems often function in isolation. And so really being able to work together, because we're working with one person, but they have many, many facets to them. I think another thing that really came out is survivors had a lot to say, and they wanted to speak and they wanted to tell their stories, just like Adaline, your story had such power, right? And you reclaimed it. But I think it was really important, and they wanted more opportunities to tell these stories, specifically to challenge the negative stereotypes that they felt like were being placed upon them. There was a fourth recommendations about improving survivor protections from these kinds of housing discriminations and tenant exploitation that was pretty common. And so at a policy level, these are things we really have to consider, like, are the protections adequate? And where they're present, like, are we really informing people about their rights and how to really, exercise those rights? And then the last two really are more, very macro, but really, I think, important, is that we have to be part of the solution in terms of increasing the affordable housing resources and ensuring that there's equitable access for all people to take advantage of those resources. And then just not looking at the housing as isolated from community, because communities need to be connected with transportation, and people have to have childcare and all the things that contribute to people being able to be productive and generate their wealth and all of that. And that we really have to support and understand the community investments that are needed to kind of target the underlying causes. So I hope I didn't go too fast, but I wanted to make sure to get through everything.
That was so wonderful. Thank you so much, Shanti. And I'm just so I don't know, it feels like all that we presented is so interwoven, and we have these themes that are coming up and that have really lifted themselves in so many ways. I mean, I really appreciate what you said about naming and seeing racism and white supremacy, and really collectively understanding it and breaking it down. That's the piece around shared language, and just connecting to what Dean had said about, like, we have all these structures that are operating in this way. How are we're going to just be like fish in, not able to see the water that we're swimming in. And so I really think that that's a really powerful message for all of us. And it starts with us. Like it starts with our own individual awareness and building that practice to see what we can't see, because we've been socialized the way we've been socialized as a society, each of us. And then that piece about Black, Indigenous, POC leadership, I think it's like, as a growth strategy, if that's like the only anti-racism thing that you do as an organization, please do it, because those experiences, and especially people that are holding lived experiences of homelessness as well, they inform the work holistically. And yeah, I'm really happy that the culturally specific practices that you named, and I don't think we talked in great detail outside of your presentation around the advocacy and the systems advocacy that needs to happen, which is really strong. That's what we're doing right now. So I'm really pleased that was named, and the power sharing and the authenticity, like that to a T. I was like, oh my gosh, that's just what Adaline said. And that piece about cross-sector relationships reminded me of what Adaline had said about her multidisciplinary team, that everyone is doing slightly different things, but it's a team of different experts and providers to support that individual. So lots of really, really great practices that I think we've named in a lot of different ways. And I just want to give us a moment as a community, as a learning community right now, to reflect on what those, some of those themes that came up, and to ask, and if folks would respond in the chat, what can you weave into your work? Like, what can you weave into your work today from the practices that we discussed, from the examining, like, okay, what does retention look like, with the power that I have, with the community that I'm in? What does retention look like for Black, Indigenous people of color? How are we incorporating an anti-racist lens? Like, what can we, by way of training, like Adaline mentioned, do to be conscious of that? So if folks can enter into the chat, and we're actually coming up on, oh my goodness, the end of the session. It was like 5 seconds. I knew it was gonna go fast, but it always surprises me how fast it goes. So do we have any questions in the audience? I don't know if we got any. I think we're a pretty small group. So no worries, but you have us all to yourselves. If there are any questions for any of us, we certainly would love to just, even if it's not a question, even if it's just a reflection, please feel free to share that with us as well. We want to know how you guys are processing this information. Even if it's like sharing with us what kind of community participatory action research is happening in your communities around this subject, we'd certainly be happy to hear about that. We want to know that world. And I'm grateful for all the comments and affirmations in the chat. I haven't been able to quite read every one of them, but I see it's very active. And I guess as we're waiting, in case people are formulating their questions, I just want to just go back to the panel and offer us like what might be some of the work that we're doing in our next steps around practicing anti-racism. No, don't mean to put you guys on the spot. I just figure I'm curious, and I I can start first. I mean, I know for me, meditation is really, really important for kind of unearthing some of the internalized inferiority and unpacking my own racial trauma. So that's a continued practice that I'm going to continue to try and elevate. Oh, I'm seeing some comments. And also just the work that I'm doing in partnership with each of you and in my new role around really starting to look at what kind of frameworks can we implement to create a container for us to practice this work together as researchers, policymakers, practitioners. How can we really be unified? And so hoping to do that in my role with the Homelessness Policy Research Institute. So I just want to open it to the panel. Any reflections?
I can go first. I was like, okay. For me, I think I want to say, because there was a comment that hit home absolutely. I believe his name was Marcus Arman. Thank you for that comment. He had stated something around the lines that I may have expected the apartment manager to know ahead of time, like know what she like is doing when it comes to being in that position and knowing these important issues when working with domestic violence survivors, working with youth that were previously homeless. And I think for me, I want not only those that I work with, I want to continue being a voice for them, and connecting my experience to some of the stuff that the participants may say, because you always get participants, you always get those that are in recovery from homelessness, domestic violence, that are going to have that wall, and they're going to say some things to the case managers, to those that work with them, because they don't trust them. They may say some things that are off-putting, and you might be like, I just want to help you. I just want to be there for you. And they may not feel that. And one of the things that I try to do, and I'm definitely going to take Marcus's comment and keep it resonating with me for the next 5-6 years, 10 years, is just that when I talk to these participants, emphasize that that person may not, like the people that you worked with in the past that did not know what was going on, they may have not just known these important issues. They may have not known what trauma is. They may have not known what a domestic violence survivor is. I don't know how many times I've told someone, you heard of intimate partner violence, you heard of domestic violence, and they go, there's a difference. What is that? What are you talking about? Because they've never seen it in their community. They never, they live in this bubble where that stuff isn't talked about. Or like even now, there's policies coming out where they're not even having education that has Black and Brown and BIPOC, information shared. There's policies created in states. I hate to put Texas on blast. I'm putting Texas on blast, and stopping history. And history is so important. You're not supposed to hide it, put it under the bed. You're not supposed to do that. Everyone's history, down to the last person you're talking to. Do you want your child's history not to be taught? Or what's the point of taking pictures if you're not going to show them? What's the point of having all of this important information from your history, from your family, having Christmas and, putting up a tree, but not putting any presents under the tree? I'm going to put up a tree with my children, but I'm not going to give them not one present. I'm going to explain what Christmas is and put up these lights, and we're all going to have a good meal on Thanksgiving. But, I'm not going to talk about the importance of Thanksgiving. What is Thanksgiving? Don't give the future generation, don't give the participants the tools to make it without explaining them. and understanding that the person that you worked with in the past, I mean, I'm not giving you these tools, but I am giving you these tools, and I'm going to explain these tools. You know, I dislike it when people give acronyms like WDDD, and then they don't explain it, and you're like, excuse me, can you? You know, I'm always on if I ever go to a panel and someone throws acronyms out there, and I'm like always the first person commenting Q&A, can you explain that? You know, not everyone in the room knows that. They don't work in the same field you work in. They're here to learn. And I will try not to go too much time, but yeah, that's when he wrote that, all that came to me from that one comment. So thank you, you know, yeah, so thank you. Yeah. Thank you, Marcus, Armin.
Yeah, thank you, Marcus. And thank you, Adaline, for naming so many more important points, especially the history that we need to understand our race history in order to really recognize the depth of the issue that we're in. So that's a huge point that was really important. Thank you for raising that. Dean or Shanti?
Oh, I was just thinking about what you were saying about acronyms, and it seems like such a small thing, but really it's not, right? Because it's sort of like it demonstrates like who knows and who doesn't know, right? And there are all these ways we kind of create boundaries, right, about like who has knowledge and who doesn't have knowledge. And I think if we really want to be inclusive and we really want to meet people where they are and learn from people, that it means we have to be really careful about our professional language, right? And speak. I think like we've been socializing that professional language in some ways to show that like our authority and show that we're smart and show that we can that we have power. But in a way, like that's the thing we're being called to give up, right? Like just to, when we're talking about power sharing. So I appreciate what you said.
Absolutely. Our language has to be accessible. Thank you for naming that, Adaline, and for highlighting it, Shanti. So, Mark, did you have any last, I'm looking at Obermark, I'm in Dean. Do you have any last sort of words for us? I know we had you at the very beginning of the presentation, and I haven't heard your voice in a little while.
Oh yeah, I was. It's funny though. My dad is Mark Obermark, so he unfortunately does have that weird name. Yeah, and my brother too.
I knew that. I knew that.
Yeah, I know somebody really
your
dug into
brother
the
too?
alliteration. Yeah, he goes by Matt though, so he escaped the clunkiness of Mark Obermark. But I was just thinking about. We were talking about practices, right, to improve service delivery for folks who are, you know, running PSH for survivors of DV, but I think a lot of what we highlighted really resonated with me, like for its applicability in research, right? Because that's what I do. Like research in itself certainly can be complicit with structural racism, can perpetuate structural racism, and is shaped by these factors too. And I think like both the calls for cultural humility and just the intentional seeing, like thinking through the positionality of my own organization, right? Like who we work with, who we get money from, how we share power, how we don't share power, and that need for sort of self-reflection, both on a personal and like organizational level, is something that I feel like I'm bringing back to my own work today. So even though we're talking about some, I guess, a very specific sort of venue or type of services, like these are insights that are applicable to people doing all sorts of things. So I appreciate that.
Yes, thank you for bringing the systems kind of a macro focus, touching on that one more time. And I apologize. Let me pass to Amy. Thank you all for this wonderful conversation.
Beautiful conversation. Thank you so much to our panelists and to everyone who's attended today. This is the second of a 4-part series of deeper dives into the toolkit. Our next conversation is on October 20th at 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time on trauma-informed care in architecture and operations design. We hope you'll return with us, and thank you so much for coming today.
Thanks so much, everyone. Be well.